Hey guys, tonight we're hopping in our imaginary time machine, packing our imaginary sunblock. Trust me, you'll need it, and heading back to walk alongside some of history's most important travelers, the spice caravan traders of ancient Arabia. You're standing under a sun that feels less like a warm hug and more like a blacksmith's forge, squinting out at a horizon that shimmers and dances like a mirage. Dust devils spin like tiny angry dervishes across sand that stretches endlessly in every direction. The air tastes like grit and dryness, and the only sound is the wind, whispering secrets you can't quite understand, mixed with the surprisingly loud chewing of a nearby camel. It's hot. Like, really hot. The kind of hot that makes you question every life choice that led you to this point. Oh, and just so we're clear, if this were real life, the chances of you making it through this journey without at least a nasty case of sunstroke sand-filled everything, and possibly encountering some folks who aren't exactly thrilled to see you passing through? Let's just say slim to none feels optimistic. You probably won't survive this in authentic historical context, but hey, at least we're doing it from the comfort of wherever you are right now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Always fascinating to see who's up with me on this little historical adventure. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the fringes of what will become for centuries a pulsating artery of global trade. Not the Silk Road, not the Amber Road, but the one that smelled arguably the best, or maybe the most intensely depending on your preference for frankincense and myrrh. This is the incense route, though it carried far more than just those aromatic resins. This is where the most precious commodities of the ancient world, spices, made their arduous journey from distant lands across vast oceans and finally onto the backs of camels for the long, dusty trek northward through the heart of Arabia. Imagine the logistics for a second. We complain about shipping delays now, right? My package is stuck in transit. Hi. These guys were looking at months of travel facing bandits' brutal weather and the constant risk of getting hopelessly lost in a landscape that actively tries to kill you. No GPS, folks. Just stars, ancient waypoints, and a prayer. For millennia, the peoples of what we now call the Arabian Peninsula were the gatekeepers, the essential middlemen in this high-stakes game of supply and demand. They didn't grow most of these spices themselves. They were the crucial bridge between the places where spices like cinnamon, cassia pepper, and ginger originated. Lands far to the east in India, Southeast Asia, maybe even beyond, and the insatiable markets of the Mediterranean world, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and later the Byzantine Empire and Europe. Think about it. These weren't just flavor enhancers back then. Spices were currency. They were medicine. They were perfume. They were status symbols of the highest order. Owning a pinch of black pepper was like flashing a designer watch today, but probably more impressive because it meant you were connected to this incredible, mysterious global network. You could literally buy land with pepper. Try doing that with your fancy wristwatch. The starting point for many of these caravans, the true southern anchors of the land route, were ports along the southern coast of Arabia in regions corresponding roughly to modern-day Yemen and Oman. Places with names that still conjure images of ancient wealth and exotic goods. Aden Kana Musa, and later Palmyra, further north Petra and Gaza on the Mediterranean coast. These ports weren't just docks. They were bustling, vibrant hubs where ships arrived, unloaded their precious aromatic cargo, and the real work of organizing the overland journey began. You'd see sailors who'd navigated the often treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean, rubbing shoulders with desert dwellers who knew the trackless sands like the back of their calloused hands. The air would hum with dozens of languages, the clatter of goods being moved, the shouts of merchants and the low grumbles of camels being readied. And those camels, the ships of the desert. You might think they're just cranky, spitting machines, and okay, sometimes they are, but without them, this whole system collapses. They are uniquely adapted to this environment. They can go for long periods without water store fat in their humps, which, fun fact, are not for water storage. That's a myth. They're like built-in packed lunches, and their wide feet are perfect for trudging through sand without sinking. A healthy, strong camel could carry hundreds of pounds of precious cargo. And not just spices. The caravans were ecosystems of trade. They carried textiles, precious stones, metals, animals, and yes, slaves. But the spices were the main event. The reason everyone was out here risking their lives under that brutal sun. Mainstream historical fact for you. The incense route and related spice trade routes through Arabia were firmly established by the first millennium BCE and potentially much earlier, flourishing for over 1,000 years before declining with shifts in global power and sea routes. It wasn't a single road, but more like a network of trails adapting over time, based on political stability, water sources, and destination markets. Now, a quirky tidbit. Ancient texts like Pliny the Elder's Natural History describe the incredible and often wildly inaccurate tales the Arabian traders would tell the Romans about the origins of spices. They spun yarns about cinnamon sticks being guarded by ferocious birds that nested on inaccessible cliffs, requiring elaborate schemes with ox hides to retrieve, or cassia growing in dangerous swamps guarded by venomous snakes. They did this partly to justify the exorbitant prices, partly to maintain their monopoly by making the source sound terrifyingly unreachable. It was brilliant marketing, really. Oh, you want pepper? Yeah, well, we had to fight off griffins made of fire to get it, so that's why it costs more than your house. Historians still argue whether the earliest Arabian involvement in this trade was primarily as growers of frankincense and myrrh, who then branched out, or if they were initially intermediaries, facilitating the movement of goods originating solely from further east. Was it homegrown aromatics? First, then transit? Or transit first, then leveraging their existing aromatic wealth? The debate continues as new archaeological evidence surfaces. You're standing there adjusting the cloth over your face to keep the dust out, feeling the weight of your own meager supplies surrounded by hundreds, maybe thousands of people and camels. The air is thick with anticipation, the smell of dry earth animal, and maybe a faint, tantalizing whiff of something exotic being loaded nearby. This is it, the beginning of the journey. Your journey for the next little while alongside these ancient travelers. And trust me, compared to their commute, yours is a walk in the park. You're still feeling the grit under your feet, maybe swatting away a fly that's decided your nose is its new favorite landing spot. The air here on the coast is a little different than the deep desert. Maybe a hint of salt, a vague smell of drying fish mingling with the exciting, pungent aromas, wafting from bales and sacks on the docks. But where did those aromas actually come from? Because this wasn't the source, remember? This was just a transit point. To understand the true journey, you have to look out beyond the dusty horizon, across the vast, shimmering expanse of the Indian Ocean, for the people living in the Mediterranean world where these spices were eventually heading. The origin of things like cinnamon cloves and nutmeg was shrouded in myth and legend. They didn't know the geography of India or Southeast Asia with any real accuracy. The Arabian traders, being savvy business people, weren't exactly eager to share the details. Why would they? Their control over the route and the information about the source was their power. So the lands of origin became these semi-mythical places spoken of in hushed tones, locations of unimaginable wealth and strange wonders and probably dragons. Because why not add dragons? Imagine trying to buy something incredibly rare and valuable today and the seller just says, oh yeah, this came from a really secret place. Over there-ish. That was basically it for centuries. The Romans knew the spices came from the east, maybe India, but the specifics lost in translation, deliberately obscured or wildly distorted by tall tales. They pictured lush, faraway lands teeming with exotic plants, maybe guarded by mythical beasts reachable only by perilous sea voyages or overland treks that only the most daring or desperate attempted. Which honestly wasn't too far off the mark on the perilous part. So the real beginning of the spice journey was in places like the Malabar coast of southwestern India, famous for its black pepper, or the island of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the primary source of true cinnamon. Cassia, a close relative, often passed off as cinnamon and still as likely came from southern China or Southeast Asia. Cloves and nutmeg. Those precious potent little things originated even further afield in the Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands of Indonesia, Ginger India and China, Cardamom India, Turmeric India. See a pattern. India was kind of the central hub for many of the initial spices entering the trade network alongside lands further east. The first leg was almost always by sea. Ships, often relatively simple wooden vessels, powered by sails and oars, would ply the waters of the Indian Ocean. This was a world away from the camel caravans, but just as fraught with danger. Monsoon storms pirates navigating without modern instruments. It was a seriously risky business. You'd need to know the rhythm of the monsoon winds, blowing one way for half the year then reversing to make the journey work. Sail from India to Arabia in the summer monsoon wait, and sail back when the winter monsoon came. Miss your window and you're stuck for months, or worse, caught in a storm in the wrong season. These early maritime traders weren't just Arabian, Indians. Persians, possibly East Africans, and others were involved, creating a complex web of trade routes, crisscrossing the ocean long before the Europeans showed up and tried to take over everything. They would sail from ports in India or Sri Lanka, loaded with sacks of pepper bundles of cinnamon bark, precious woods, textiles, and other goods heading across the Arabian Sea towards the southern coast of Arabia. The ships themselves varied. Some might be small coastal traders, others larger vessels capable of making the long, open ocean crossing. They weren't luxury liners, put it that way. You'd be cramped, wet, probably seasick, and definitely bored between ports. Though the smell of your cargo might keep things interesting, or unbearable, depending on how many sacks of dried fish were stacked next to the cinnamon. The sheer logistics are mind-boggling even today. Imagine sourcing thousands of tons of various spices from scattered locations across a vast geographical area, transporting them by river or local carriers to coastal ports, loading them onto ships, sailing for weeks or months across an ocean, guided mostly by stars and wind patterns, unloading them onto another continent, and then getting them ready for another journey, this time across land. And all this without refrigeration, modern packaging, or even reliable maps. It's a testament to the incredible human drive for trade and profit, and perhaps a love for spicy food. Though ancient spice use was more about preservation, medicine, and status. Mainstream historical fact. The discovery and understanding of the monsoon wind system was absolutely critical to the development of this ancient maritime spice trade. Without knowing when the winds would blow, in which direction, long-distance sea voyages across the Indian Ocean would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for pre-modern ships. A quirky tidbit. Ancient Greek and Roman writers like Herodotus and Pliny the Elder mention the belief that cinnamon was gathered by giant birds from unknown lands. This fantastical tale, likely spread by Arabian traders to protect their source, persisted for centuries, and highlights how little was truly known in the West about the actual origins of these valuable commodities. Seriously fighting birds to get your cinnamon sticks. Sounds like a level in a video game, not real-life sourcing, but people believed it. Historians still argue whether there was direct regular sea trade between India and the Roman Empire before the discovery of the monsoon routes became widely known among Roman Egyptian sailors around the 1st century CE, credited to a sailor named Hippolus, or if the trade was almost entirely mediated by Arabian and Indian sailors, using their established knowledge of the monsoons with goods changing hands multiple times before reaching the Red Sea ports connected to the Roman world. So the spices you're about to follow didn't just magically appear on the Arabian coast. They had already completed a massive, dangerous, and often mysterious voyage. They had been cultivated in far-off lands, harvested, dried, packed, transported to distant ports, loaded onto ships, and sailed across thousands of miles of open water. By the time they were being offloaded onto the docks, you're standing near in your imagination. Of course, they already carried stories of distant suns, different cultures, and the immense effort involved in bringing them even this far. Now the next chapter, the one involving the endless sand, is about to begin. Get ready for camels. Lots and lots of camels. Alright, you've followed the faint imaginary scent of cinnamon and pepper across the waves. The salty breeze is still in your hair, but the land is getting closer, more solid. You're arriving conceptually at one of those southern Arabian ports we talked about. Think places like Qana or Musa in what is now Yemen, or maybe some ports further east in Oman. Forget massive container terminals and cranes. This is ancient world logistics. The ships, having hopefully survived the monsoon-assisted journey from India or further east, are anchored offshore or pulled up onto the beach in sheltered bays. The scene would be chaotic, vibrant, and probably incredibly smelly. You'd see sailors exhausted but relieved unloading their precious cargo. Bales wrapped in rough cloth-woven baskets, pottery jars, all carefully handled, because one dropped amphora of something valuable is a bad day for everyone. The air here is thick with the convergence of worlds. The dry, earthy smell of the desert is meeting the humid, exotic perfumes of the seaborne goods. You'd hear languages you couldn't understand. Local Arabian dialects mingling with Tamil, maybe Greek, Latin, Persian, and who knows what else. This transition point was crucial. The sea journey was over, but the longest and in some ways most challenging part of the journey was just beginning. The spices had arrived on the edge of Arabia, but they needed to get through Arabia across hundreds or even thousands of miles of often hostile desert and arid landscape to reach the wealthy markets on the Mediterranean coast. This is where the expertise of the Arabian tribes came into play. For centuries, they controlled these land routes. They knew the desert. They knew where the scattered water wells were, how to navigate by the stars, how to deal with the heat, the sandstorms, and the potential threats lurking along the way. Think of these southern ports as giant sorting facilities. The goods are unloaded, checked, maybe taxed by local rulers, and then prepared for the overland journey. This involves repacking, dividing the cargo into manageable loads for camels, and assembling the caravans themselves. It wasn't a simple process of just hiring a few guys with camels. These were massive undertakings involving hundreds, sometimes even thousands of camels, along with their drivers, guards, merchants, cooks, guides, and various hangers-on. You'd see mounds of pepper sacks, bundles of cinnamon bark, jars of spices like ginger and cardamom, maybe even more perishable goods carefully packed. The quality control back then wasn't quite Amazon Prime standard, but experienced merchants could often tell good quality from bad. You might even see them sampling a pinch of pepper, feeling the weight of a cinnamon stick, or sniffing a resin lump to check its purity. Adulteration was a constant problem, adding cheaper fillers or less potent varieties to boost profits. Caveat emptor, buyer beware, was definitely the motto of the day, and you didn't want to get caught selling fake spices to someone who'd just endured a multi-month sea voyage. Bad for business, potentially bad for your health. The tribal structure of Arabian society was key to making this route work. Certain tribes controlled specific sections of the route, offering protection for a fee, of course, and access to resources like water in exchange for safe passage. They were the lords of the desert highways. Traveling without their permission or guidance was incredibly risky, often resulting in robbery, getting lost, or worse. So part of the process at these ports was negotiating with these tribes, securing guides, guards, and ensuring the route ahead was as safe as it could be. It was a complex political and economic dance involving alliances, rivalries, and generations of accumulated desert knowledge. This reliance on local tribes also meant the route wasn't always stable. Conflicts between tribes, shifts in power, or the rise of new groups could disrupt the trade force caravans to take alternative, perhaps less ideal paths, or even halt trade altogether for periods. It was a dynamic network, constantly adapting to the shifting sands of both the desert landscape and the human power structures. Mainstream historical fact. The wealth generated by controlling key points along the incense spice route allowed southern Arabian kingdoms like the Sabaeans, Katabanians, and Hadramotis to flourish for centuries, building impressive cities, temples, and irrigation systems in an otherwise arid land, funded largely by taxes and fees levied on the passing caravans. A quirky tidbit. One of the challenges at the ports wasn't just unloading, but also storage. Goods might sit for weeks or months waiting for a caravan to assemble. Keeping precious aromatic spices safe from moisture insects, rodents, and theft in a port environment would have been a constant battle. Imagine trying to keep rats out of hundreds of sacks of premium pepper. That sounds like a particularly unpleasant job. Historians still argue whether the primary reason for the development of the overland incense route was initially the high cost and danger of ancient sea travel in the Indian Ocean, making the land route a necessary alternative, or if the Arabian tribes deliberately cultivated their role as land intermediaries to leverage their geographical position and control over desert resources for economic gain even when sea travel became more common. So you're standing amidst the organized chaos watching the unloading, the sorting, the packing. The smell of the sea is fading, replaced by the dry heat and the anticipation of the desert. The spices, having traveled thousands of miles by water, are now ready for their next equally epic journey by land. You can almost feel the weight of those sacks of pepper, the exotic fragrance of the cinnamon. Get ready to trade your sea legs for walking alongside camels. Lots of walking. Hope you packed comfortable sandals. Or maybe just enjoy the thought from your comfy chair. Much safer. Okay, so you've watched the ships come in and the goods get unloaded and the deals get struck. The port area is still buzzing, but the focus is shifting inland. The next massive undertaking is forming the caravan itself. Imagine a scene that looks less like a modern shipping yard and more like a nomadic tribe preparing for a long migration. Except this tribe is made up of hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels each, a grumpy, sandy vehicle for priceless cargo. You're standing amidst the gathering chaos. Camels are being rounded up, their low grumbles and occasional indignant roars filling the air. Drivers, their faces weathered by sun and sand, are checking saddles, ropes, and water bags. Merchants are hovering anxiously over their piles of goods, making sure everything is accounted for before it disappears onto a camel's back. The sheer scale is impressive, maybe a little overwhelming. This isn't just a few guys heading out on a road trip. This is a small city about to pack itself up and walk across the desert. The process of loading a camel is an art form. Each animal needs to be carefully balanced. Too much weight on one side and you risk the load shifting, injuring the camel, or even causing it to collapse. Loads could weigh anywhere from 300 to 500 pounds, sometimes more, depending on the camel's strength and the length of the journey. You'd see experienced handlers dividing sacks of pepper bundles, of cinnamon jars of resins, and other goods, distributing the weight evenly into saddlebags or wooden crates strapped onto the camel's humped back. It's like a giant, incredibly frustrating game of Jenga, where the pieces occasionally complain loudly and try to bite you. Besides the main cargo of spices and other trade goods, each camel, or at least a certain number of them, had to carry supplies for the journey itself. This included water bags often made of treated animal skins, which were essential and heavy. They'd also carry food for the humans, dried dates, grains, preserved meats, and maybe some supplementary fodder for the camels, though the animals were expected to forage for tough desert vegetation when possible. Trying to calculate exactly how much water and food for hundreds or thousands of people and animals over weeks or months of travel, with no resupply points other than scattered, sometimes unreliable wells. That's a logistical nightmare that would make a modern supply chain manager weep into their carefully optimized spreadsheet. The personnel involved went far beyond just the camel drivers. You had the caravan leader, the kafala bash, in later terminology, who was responsible for everything. Setting the route, managing the pace, negotiating with tribes, dealing with disputes, and making life or death decisions about when and where to rest or seek water. These were individuals of immense authority and experience. You also had guards, often heavily armed, tasked with protecting the caravan from bandits or hostile tribes. Scouts would ride ahead to check the route and look for water sources. There would be cooks, blacksmiths for repairs, religious men, and probably a few hangers-on, hoping to make a buck along the way. It was a mobile community with all the social dynamics and potential squabbles that implies. Imagine being stuck with the same few hundred people and a few thousand grumpy camels for months on end. There's bound to be some drama. Hey, did you see how Hassan loaded his camel total rookie move? My cinnamon is going to be crooked the whole way. The assembly process could take days, even weeks. Goods needed to be checked, contracts, finalized payments made often in advance or at key waypoints, personnel hired and organized. Camels needed to be rested and watered after potentially arriving from grazing grounds or previous journeys. It was a period of intense activity, negotiation, and preparation before the long, slow rhythm of the desert march began. You'd hear the clatter of equipment, the shouts of handlers, the low murmur of conversations in multiple languages, and always the omnipresent sounds of the camels. Mainstream historical fact. A single large caravan could consist of several thousand camels and hundreds of people, forming a line of animals and humans stretching for miles across the desert landscape, effectively becoming a moving city. The wealth contained within such a caravan was immense, making it both a tempting target and a powerful entity capable of defending itself. A quirky tidbit. While camels store fat in their humps, their ability to go without water is thanks to a combination of physiological adaptations, including being able to tolerate a much higher degree of dehydration than most mammals and then rehydrating, rapidly drinking vast quantities of water when available. They can lose up to 25% of their body weight in water loss, whereas most mammals struggle at 10–15%. So they weren't just carrying water for the journey, they were biologically built for the journey without it. Impressive if slightly unnerving when you think about their ability to rehydrate. Historians still argue whether the composition of the caravan personnel primarily reflected the power structure of the originating ports dominated by wealthy merchants or the land-controlling tribes with tribal leaders taking key roles, or if it was a complex shifting mix depending on the specific route era and involved parties. Who really called the shots when you were miles from anywhere? Finally, after days of preparation, the moment arrives. The caravan begins to move. It's not a sudden rush. It's a slow, deliberate unfolding. Camels are guided into line one after another, often tied together in long strings. The sun is likely just starting to climb, casting long shadows, or perhaps they choose to start in the cooler late afternoon. You join the procession, falling into step with the slow, swaying gait of the camels. The air is thick with dust, the smell of animals, and the faintest, most exciting promise of the fragrant treasures you are helping to transport. The port fades behind you, and the vast, silent, and utterly indifferent desert stretches ahead. The journey, the real journey across the sands has begun, and you are now part of it. Hope those sandals are comfortable. Okay, you're walking now. The rhythm of the camel train is slow, steady, almost hypnotic. The desert is a canvas of muted browns, ochres, and golds under a relentless blue sky. But your focus and the focus of everyone else here is on the cargo. These aren't just packages. These are the reasons this entire massive undertaking exists. These are the precious spices, the aromatic treasures that fueled economies and fired imaginations across the ancient world. What exactly are you helping to carry? Well, the stars of the show on the Incense Route were ironically initially frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins tapped from trees growing in southern Arabia and East Africa. These were highly prized for religious ceremonies, perfumes, and medicines in Egypt, Rome, and beyond. The route was literally named after them. But over time, as trade from the East increased, they were joined and perhaps even surpassed in sheer volume and value by spices originating from far beyond Arabia. You'd be looking at sacks upon sacks of black pepper piper nigrum. This was gold, literally. Roman sources complain about the vast sums of money flowing out of the empire to pay for pepper. It was used for flavoring preservation medicine and as a sign of wealth. A single peppercorn could be worth a significant amount. Imagine guarding a bag of rocks today that were individually worth more than your weekly wages. That was pepper. It came from India, often in dried black form, sometimes green or white, but black was the most common and widely traded. Then there's cinnamon Cinnamomum verum, the true cinnamon, mostly from Sri Lanka, and its close cousin Cassia Cinnamomum aromaticum from China or Southeast Asia. Ancient sources often confuse the two, and traders sometimes sold cassia, which is cheaper and has a stronger, less subtle flavor as true cinnamon. Both were hugely popular for cooking perfumes and medicine. Think about the effort to get dried bark all the way from an island off the coast of India across an ocean and then across this desert. It gives cinnamon challenge a whole new meaning. Ginger zingiber officinale would also be in the mix, likely from India or China, used for flavor medicine and its warming properties. Cardamom elitaria cardamomum, another expensive and highly aromatic spice from India, would be there too. Its intense fragrance would probably be one of the few pleasant smells cutting through the dust and animal odor. Less common but incredibly valuable would be clove syzygium, aromaticum, and nutmeg myristica fragrans, originating from the distant Moluccas in Indonesia. These were even harder to come by and fetched astronomical prices. Imagine guarding a small sack of nutmeg back then. You were basically carrying around a retirement fund on a camel. Beyond the headliners, caravans carried a variety of other goods considered spices or aromatics in the broader sense. Turmeric for color and medicine, cumin, coriander, possibly even things like dried fruits, sugar, and various resins used for incense or medicinal purposes. Precious woods like sandalwood pearls, precious stones, textiles, silks, cottons, dyes, and even certain animals could be part of the cargo manifest. But the spices, the real spices from the East, were the high-value items that made the risks worthwhile. The quantities involved were substantial. While ancient accounts might exaggerate, archaeological finds and economic analyses suggest that tons of these goods were being transported annually. The value wasn't just in the weight, but in the concentration of value. You could carry a lot of wealth in a relatively small, lightweight package compared to, say, grain or timber. This concentration of value is what made the spice trade so lucrative and so dangerous. Everyone wanted a piece of it. Packing these goods for the long journey was crucial. They needed to be protected from moisture rare in the desert, but still a risk at the start, and insects and damage. They were often packed in multiple layers of cloth, sealed in jars, or placed in sturdy wooden chests. The goal was to deliver them to the buyer in as pristine a condition as possible, preserving their aroma, potency, and value. Imagine a speck of dust landing on a precious peppercorn after it traveled for months. Mildly infuriating. Mainstream historical fact. The sheer volume and value of the spice trade through Arabia, particularly during the Roman era, was a significant drain on the Roman economy, leading some Roman writers to lament the amount of gold and silver being spent on what they considered frivolous luxuries, though many used spices for medicinal purposes too. A quirky tidbit. The Romans were so fond of pepper that when Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome in 410, CE, part of the ransom demanded to lift the siege included 3,000 pounds of pepper, alongside gold and silver. That's roughly 1.3 metric tons of pepper. Imagine trying to find that much pepper today on short notice, let alone back then. Historians still argue whether the dominance of Arabian traders in the overland spice route was primarily due to their unique knowledge of desert survival and navigation, or more because they successfully leveraged tribal networks and military strength to control access points and ensure relative security along the route, effectively creating a protected corridor for trade. Was it expertise or control? You're walking along the scent of pepper occasionally catching on the breeze, mingling with the dry heat. You know that every sack, every jar represents an immense amount of effort, risk, and desire. These aren't just dried plants, they are pieces of a global puzzle connecting distant lands and cultures, driving economies and embodying luxury and power. You're not just walking in the desert, you're walking alongside liquid gold in plant form. And you'd better watch your step. Don't want to drop any of that precious cargo. Alright, the novelty of walking is probably wearing off by now. You've settled into the pace, the quiet punctuated by camel noises and wind, and the relentless sun. You're leaving the relatively hospitable coast behind and plunging into the heart of the Arabian desert. This is where the true challenge begins. The route isn't just a line on a map. It's a network forged over centuries linking scattered oases, wells, and trading posts. The most famous section of the Incense Route went north from ports like Qana, following a general path through what is now Yemen and Saudi Arabia, bypassing the toughest parts of the empty quarter. It would head towards key centers like Marib in modern Yemen, the capital of the ancient Sabaean kingdom, famous for its massive dam and wealth derived from the trade. From there, the route continued north, eventually passing through cities that rose to prominence because of the caravan traffic. Think of these cities and outposts not just as stops, but as essential nodes in the network. Places like Najran, then northward towards the Hejaz region, where later Mecca and Medina would rise, though their prominence in the deepest ancient incense route period is a subject of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Mecca was a significant caravan stop before the rise of Islam, or gained its prominence primarily with it. Further north, incredibly important waypoints included Hegra, modern Madayan Salih, a Nabatean city carved into the rock showcasing the wealth accumulated from controlling this passage and ultimately reaching the jewel of the Nabatean kingdom, Petra. Petra. You've seen pictures? Those incredible facades carved into rose-red cliffs. That city's very existence, its immense beauty and wealth was funded almost entirely by controlling a vital choke point on the Incense Route. Caravans paid tolls to pass through Nabatean territory to access their wells and security. The Nabateans were masters of water management in an arid land which was perhaps their greatest asset in dominating a key section of the route. Imagine controlling the only gas station for hundreds of miles. You can charge whatever you want, right? That was the Nabatean business model. The journey between these points could be grueling. Miles upon miles of sand and rock. Temperatures soaring during the day, plummeting at night. The wind could whip up sudden blinding sandstorms, disorienting the caravan covering tracks and making breathing difficult. Finding water was a constant anxiety. Wells might be dry, contaminated, or even controlled by hostile groups. The route would sometimes deviate significantly to reach a known water source or bypass a dangerous area. There was no straight line across the desert. It was a path woven around necessity and danger. Navigation was done by experienced guides who knew the subtle contours of the land, the position of the sun and stars, and relied on generational knowledge passed down orally. Landmarks were few and far between. A distinctive rock formation, a dried-up riverbed, the scattered remains of previous, perhaps less fortunate travelers. Getting lost out here was not a minor inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The pace was slow and steady. Camels are built for endurance, not speed. You'd likely travel during the cooler parts of the day, early morning and late afternoon into evening, sometimes even through the night by moonlight and starlight, and rest during the intense midday heat. Setting up and breaking down camp would become a familiar routine. Meals would be simple, often prepared over open fires. The nights away from any light pollution would be filled with an unimaginable number of stars, silent witness to the passage of these slow-moving rivers of wealth. Beyond natural challenges, there were human threats. Bandits lurked looking to raid valuable caravans. Hostile tribes might demand exorbitant tolls or try to ambush the travelers. The large size of caravans was partly a defense mechanism, safety in numbers. The armed guards were there for a reason, and skirmishes were not unheard of. Every stretch of the journey held its own unique blend of geographical and human risk. Mainstream historical fact. Petra, the iconic city carved into cliffs in modern Jordan, rose to prominence as the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, largely because of its strategic position controlling the northern reaches of the Incense Route, levying taxes and providing services to passing caravans, which allowed them to accumulate immense wealth. A quirky tidbit: camels aren't just pack animals. They are surprisingly stubborn and capable of refusing to move if they sense danger or are simply overloaded and unhappy. A truly uncooperative camel could hold up an entire caravan. Dealing with a multi-ton animal having a bad attitude in the middle of nowhere required a special kind of patience. Probably best not to call them names. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for cities like Petra and Hegra was solely the revenue from transit trade, or if they developed substantial local economies based on agriculture, enabled by sophisticated irrigation like the myrrh, local crafts or other resources, making them more than just stops on a highway, but regional centers in their own right. You're walking. The dunes stretch the rocks, loom, the sun beats down, but you are moving. With every slow step, you're covering miles, inching closer to the rich markets that await. You're not just an anonymous figure in a historical painting. You're part of this ancient machine of global commerce, enduring the dust and heat to move spices across the world. Feel the weight of the journey in your imaginary tired feet. And maybe start hoping the next oasis is actually where the guide says it is. The desert is a surprisingly varied place, though perhaps not in ways you might expect. It's not just endless flat sand, though there's plenty of that. There are rocky mountains, vast gravel plains known as Sarir or Reg Wadis that might briefly hold water after a rare rain, and of course the scattered oases. As you travel, you're not just interacting with the landscape, but with the people who live in or traverse it. The life along the route was as integral to its functioning as the spices themselves. The caravan personnel were a diverse bunch. At the top, the wealthy merchants, perhaps few in number within the caravan itself, often leaving the day-to-day management to others. These were the investors, the risk-takers who funded the venture. They might be Arabs, but could also be people from the Mediterranean world, Indians, or others based in the southern Arabian ports, part of diasporic trading communities. They represented the distant demand and supply ends. Then you have the Arabian tribes, the original masters of this land. They weren't just raiders. Many were partners in the trade. Some tribes controlled specific segments of the route, offering protection and guidance. Caravan leaders had to negotiate safe passage pay tolls or fees, often a fixed amount per camel or per type of goods, and maintain good relations. These interactions could be tense, a mix of mutual dependence and potential conflict. A tribe could offer a lifeline of water and safety one day and pose a threat the next if negotiations went poorly. The camel drivers, or saris, were the backbone of the operation. These were hard-working individuals, often from the local tribes or dependent communities. They were skilled in handling camels, loading and unloading cargo, finding pasture where none seemed to exist, and navigating alongside the guides. Their lives were tough, marked by long hours, little comfort, and constant exposure to the elements. They likely sang songs or told stories to pass the endless hours of walking, creating a unique oral culture of the caravans. Imagine the kinds of inside jokes you develop when you're walking with the same dromedary for months. Probably involved spit. The guards were essential, providing security against external threats. They needed to be capable fighters, familiar with the terrain, and utterly loyal to the caravan leader and merchants. Their presence was a deterrent, but they also had to be ready for confrontation. Bandits might be desperate individuals or organized groups seeing the caravans as mobile treasuries. Surviving an ambush required discipline, courage, and probably a fair bit of luck. At the oases and trading posts, life was concentrated and bustling compared to the empty spaces between them. These were not just wells. They were sometimes small settlements offering vital services. Here the caravan could replenish water supplies, rest, make minor repairs to equipment, trade goods, with local residents, perhaps textiles for food, or dates for tools, and gather information about the route ahead. News traveled slowly across the desert, often carried by these very caravans. You might hear news from the Mediterranean world, tales from India, or gossip from another caravan encountered days ago. These were melting pots of culture and information, temporary hubs, connecting disparate worlds. Certain individuals along the route might specialize in specific services: blacksmiths to repair camel saddles, and equipment water vendors at spots away from the main wells, likely at a steep price. Guides with unique knowledge of particular stretches of the desert. The economies of many of these remote areas were directly tied to the passage of the caravans. This long journey wasn't just economic. It facilitated cultural exchange. People from different backgrounds traveled and worked together, sharing knowledge, beliefs, and possibly even languages. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles filtered along these routes, influencing the societies they connected. The design of a piece of jewelry in Petra might show Indian influence, or a Roman coin might turn up surprisingly far south. The aroma of exotic spices permeated more than just food. It scented the interactions between the people along the way. Mainstream historical fact: the Nabatean kingdom, with its capital at Petra, not only controlled and taxed the trade passing through their territory, but also actively participated in it as merchants and carriers themselves, using their intimate knowledge of the desert to maintain their competitive edge. A quirky tidbit: staying clean on the route would have been a massive challenge. Limited water meant prioritizing drinking over washing, so you'd be hot, sweaty, dusty, and constantly grimy. The only thing keeping things maybe a little fresh was the incredible smell of the cargo. Imagine rolling around in a sack of cinnamon just to feel slightly less... You actually don't imagine that you'd get fired. Historians still argue whether the primary social impact of the spice trade on the Arabian Peninsula was to create hierarchical kingdoms in urban centers like Myrrh and Petra, dependent on trade wealth, or if it largely reinforced existing tribal structures and power dynamics by providing new opportunities for traditional leaders to exert control over lucrative routes. You've met the camel drivers, seen the guards patrolling the flanks, maybe exchanged a few words through gestures or a shared basic vocabulary with people at an oasis stop. You feel the human presence along this ancient highway. Everyone plays a role, from the wealthy merchant sponsoring the journey to the humble water carrier filling skins at a well. This isn't just nature versus caravan. It's a complex human system navigating a harsh environment, bound together by the pursuit of aromatic treasure. And the spices. They're just chilling on the camels, smelling fabulous, completely unaware of the intricate human drama they are causing. You've been walking for what feels like forever, measuring time by the rising and setting of the sun, the aching of your muscles, and the slow sway of the camel just ahead of you. But gradually, subtly, the landscape begins to shift. The sand might become less ubiquitous, replaced by rocky ground or scrubby vegetation that looks slightly less determined to give up on life. Distant mountains might resolve into clearer shapes on the horizon. Mountains you actually have maps for now. The air might feel different, perhaps a little heavier, carrying sense of distant civilization rather than just dust and animal. You're leaving the deep, raw desert behind and approaching the more settled, populated northern edges of the Arabian world, the crucial transition points where the overland route met the markets of the Mediterranean. The excitement in the caravan builds palpable tension. Months of grueling travel, constant vigilance against sandstorms and bandits, the endless thirst and aching fatigue. It's all focused on this arrival. You're nearing cities, or at least large trading posts where the real business happens, where the weary journey finally pays off. You're probably starting to think about things other than just putting one foot in front of the other and making sure you don't get lost or eaten by something the guide might have only half-jokingly warned you about back in Section 1. Like actual food that isn't dried dates, maybe. A bath. Yes, definitely thinking about a bath. Depending on the exact path taken, your caravan might be heading towards Petra, that magnificent city, nestled in the mountains, approached through a narrow canyon. Or perhaps further west towards the edges of Roman control in what is now Jordan and Israel, aiming for ports like Gaza on the Mediterranean coast, or even eastward towards Damascus and Syria, another major ancient trading hub connected to various routes. Some routes even curled into the Sinai Peninsula, connecting to Egyptian ports on the Red Sea, from which goods could be shipped north to Alexandria, a superpower in ancient trade. These places were the grand finale for the camel part of the show. Arriving at one of these terminals would be an explosion of sensory input after the monotonous quiet of the desert. Suddenly, there are walls, buildings, crowds of people who haven't been covered in dust for months. The air buzzes with noise, shouts of porters bargaining in multiple languages, the clang of metal, the lowing of animals that aren't camels, and the smells. 1,000 different smells compared to the uniform dryness of the desert. Cooking food? Different animals, human bodies, perhaps even the lingering scent of perfumes or incense being sold in the marketplace. It's overwhelming, vibrant, maybe a little frightening after so long in isolation. It feels less like an arrival and more like a collision. Whoa, personal space was definitely a desert luxury, wasn't it? You might mutter to yourself. The spices you've guarded so carefully are now unloaded. They pass from the dusty world of the caravan into the stone warehouses and bustling markets of the northern cities. Here, merchants from Rome, Greece, Egypt, Syria, and other parts of the Mediterranean world are waiting. They have the capital, the ships, and the connections to move the spices, the final legs of their journey across the sea, to the insatiable consumer markets in the empire and beyond. This is where the Arabian middlemen who controlled the desert route cashed in. The markup on spices after traveling this far was astronomical. That pinch of pepper that cost relatively little near its source in India might sell for 100 or 1,000 times more by the time it reached Rome. Think about the prices. Roman writers lamented the amount of gold and silver leaving the empire to pay for Eastern luxuries, especially spices. Pliny the Elder calculated that India drained Rome of immense sums annually for commodities like pepper. The people who bought these spices in Rome weren't using them sparingly either. Roman cookbooks mention generous use of pepper and other spices. Elite Romans would flaunt their wealth with lavish, heavily spiced banquets. Spices were status symbols, proof that you were connected to the vast exotic world of global trade. You might complain about the price of saffron today, but try buying a few pounds of pepper in ancient Rome after it traveled via this route. You'd need a second mortgage on your villa. Probably. These northern cities, places like Petra or Gaza, grew incredibly rich from this trade. They levied taxes on the goods passing through, provided lodging security and services to the merchants and caravan personnel, and participated in the trade themselves, buying low relatively from the incoming caravans and selling high to the distributors heading further north or west. Their impressive architecture and infrastructure, temples, tombs, theaters, market complexes, are testaments to the wealth generated by sitting astride these crucial junctions. It's incredible how much wealth literally came walking in on the back of a camel. Mainstream historical fact: the city of Petra controlled access through a vital valley that allowed caravans to avoid hostile territory and reach markets. By taxing this passage and controlling the essential water supply in their region, the Nabateans became immensely wealthy, fueling their elaborate, rock-cut architecture and status as a major regional power before eventually being annexed by the Roman Empire. A quirky tidbit: Roman writers like Apicius included complex recipes featuring large amounts of spices, like pepper, cumin, coriander, and silphium. A prized herbed yash resin from North Africa itself, a trade item. One recipe for a spicy patina, like a quiche or savory pudding, uses pepper, cumin, coriander, fennel seed, rue, and date syrup, proving Romans definitely weren't shy about using multiple strong flavors together. Is this spicy enough? Now was probably a common question. Historians still argue whether the decline of the overland Arabian spice routes was primarily due to the increasing safety and efficiency of sea routes via the Red Sea and Egypt, particularly after the Roman discovery of reliable monsoon winds, or if political instability, tribal conflicts, and the rise of competing land routes in other regions played a more significant role in diverting traffic away from the classic Incense Route path. So you've made it. The desert trek is over. You're surrounded by the noise and energy of a bustling city. The sacks of spices are being counted, weighed, and sold, the final transactions of this leg of the journey. You see people, Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, inspecting the quality of the pepper, the aroma of the cinnamon. They are the final consumers, or the next link in the distribution chain, about to send these treasures off by ship across the Mediterranean. You look back towards the direction you came, a vast, empty expanse that seems impossible to have crossed. But you did. And those spices, they're still not finished traveling. They're heading out to flavor dinner parties, scent temples, and grace apothecaries' desks across the ancient world. Your feet hurt, you're still dusty, but you were part of it. The great ancient spice caravan. Give yourself a mental high five, and maybe go find that imaginary bath now. You've seen the transaction, the handing over of goods that cost sweat, time, and significant risk to bring this far. It's in places like Petra or Gaza or other less famous hubs further north that the Arabian spice route truly reached its commercial climax. For centuries, roughly from the late Hellenistic period through the peak of the Roman Empire and even into the early Byzantine era, this wasn't just a trade route, it was the artery for luxury goods flowing from the east to the west. The demand from empires like Rome for spices, aromatic silks, and other exotic commodities was astronomical, and the incense route, carrying far more than just incense, was a primary way to satisfy that craving. During its zenith, the volume of goods, the size and frequency of the caravans, and the wealth they generated would have been at their peak. Imagine not just one massive caravan every few months, but multiple trains traversing the sands, simultaneously following slightly different paths, meeting at oases, bringing constant life and commerce to the otherwise barren interior. Cities like Petra weren't just getting by. They were flourishing, using the incredible wealth from taxing the trade and participating in it to build their spectacular monuments and create sophisticated water systems that seem miraculous given the environment. Myrrh further south used trade revenues to maintain and expand its truly ancient and epic dam, supporting agriculture for tens of thousands in an improbable location. This trade built cities, fueled economies, and allowed sophisticated cultures to thrive in the desert. It literally sculpted the landscape if you consider cities carved from rock or massive dams as landscape features. The Arabian traders weren't just haulers. They were skilled negotiators, cultural bridge builders, however, inadvertently and masters of information control. They maintained their near monopoly on the overland transport by keeping the routes secret and controlling access. They leveraged their alliances and influence with desert tribes. They dictated terms and prices to the buyers waiting eagerly in the north because they were the ones who could reliably deliver the goods. The desert was their fortress, their knowledge, their shield, and the insatiable Western appetite for spices, their constant revenue stream. If you wanted cinnamon in Rome, chances are pretty high. It came across those Arabian sands on a camel first. Remember, all those stories about fighting mythical birds for cinnamon. All part of maintaining the mystique and the profit margin. A little strategic misinformation never hurt anyone, except maybe historical accuracy for a couple of thousand years. The route didn't just move goods, it facilitated the movement of people, ideas, and technologies. As we talked about earlier, you had a mix of nationalities and cultures within the caravans and at the trading posts. This contact inevitably led to cultural exchange influencing everything from religious practices to architectural styles. Roman coins flowed south in vast quantities, shaping local economies. Arabian saddles and camel handling techniques probably influenced caravan logistics elsewhere. This wasn't a one-way street of goods, it was a complex interaction shaping the ancient world. But as with all empires and major trade routes, things change. The peak doesn't last forever. The decline of the classical incense spice route through the Arabian interior was a gradual process driven by a combination of factors. The most significant was arguably the rise of alternative, particularly maritime routes. As shipbuilding technology improved as navigators became more confident, and their knowledge of the monsoon winds became more widespread, thanks in part to those Roman Egyptian sailors figuring things out sometimes. From observing Arabian and Indian sailors, sea travel became more feasible and often cheaper. Think about it. A ship can carry vastly more cargo than a string of camels. Yes, there were risks at sea storms, pirates. Different kind of pirates than the land ones, but still bad news. But once established, the economics often favored water transport for bulk goods, even luxury ones. The sea route via the Red Sea with goods shipped from India directly to ports on the Red Sea coast, and then transported the relatively short distance overland to the Nile or other connection points to the Mediterranean, started to become increasingly competitive with the long, slow, arduous camel trek all the way from southern Arabia. You didn't have to pay tolls to half a dozen different desert tribes for the pleasure of sand in your teeth if your ship just docked in Egypt. Changes in the political landscape also played a huge role. The power of the southern Arabian kingdoms waned over time. The Nabateans, key gatekeepers of the northern route through Petra, were absorbed into the Roman Empire in 100 CE. While the route didn't disappear overnight under Roman rule, the Romans initially tried to leverage and even improve parts of it, building roads in Nabatean territory. Roman interest and control eventually shifted towards more secure Red Sea routes. As empires rose and fell, their trade policies and priorities changed, impacting the profitability and safety of the ancient routes. New land routes also developed further north, passing through areas like Mesopotamia or linking directly to Central Asia and the Silk Road network, offering alternative paths for east-west trade that bypassed the Arabian interior almost entirely. As maritime trade intensified and political control shifted, the necessity and profitability of the extremely long overland journey through the heart of Arabia diminished. Caravans didn't vanish, of course. Local trade continued, and certain high-value goods might still travel part of the way overland. But the massive state-like caravans carrying tons of spices from the deepest south all the way to the Mediterranean became less frequent than rare. The vibrant trading cities reliant solely on transit fees like Petra, once it wasn't such a critical choke point, found their golden age fading. They had to adapt or decline. Mainstream historical fact. The Roman annexation of Nabatea in 106 CE, while initially leading to some infrastructure development, marked a significant shift in the power dynamics of the northern Incense Route terminals. eventually facilitating greater Roman control over Red Sea access points and contributing to the route's long-term decline as a dominant artery. A quirky tidbit: one of the alternative, though shorter, overland routes that competed with the deep Arabian one involved shipping goods across the Indian Ocean to East African ports, then across Africa to the Nile and north to Egypt. This route is much less well documented than the Arabian ones, and historians still argue how significant it was. But it shows merchants were constantly looking for different ways to move goods. Because who needs just one perilously long trade route when you could have two historians still argue whether the impact of sea routes becoming dominant was an inevitable technological progression, making land routes obsolete for bulk luxury goods, or if political and social factors like the increasing control by centralized empires, making maritime trade safer or more appealing, were the primary drivers in shifting trade patterns away from the ancient Arabian caravan paths. You're standing there having theoretically witnessed the route at its peak, but you can feel the shift happening. The camels are still here, the traders are still trading, but maybe the next caravan feels a little smaller. Maybe the prices offered aren't quite as high as the legends claim they used to be. The world outside Arabia is changing, and the power is slowly shifting away from the keepers of the sands towards the masters of the waves. The peak is past. The long, slow descent from being the essential connection to simply a way is underway. The dust seems a little sadder somehow. Okay, the caravan you metaphorically walked with has faded into the past. The golden age of the long-distance incense spice route through the heart of Arabia, carrying vast quantities of precious cargo from south to north via camel train, is over. It didn't vanish overnight, of course. These things rarely do. Like a great river drying up, it thinned out, split into smaller streams, and eventually left behind markers on the landscape. Abandoned wells, crumbling trading posts, cities whose most glorious days were tied to a time when camel bells were the soundtrack to their prosperity. Today, if you were to travel across the regions where these routes once thrived, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Negev Desert, you might stumble upon echoes of that ancient commerce. Maybe you'd see remnants of an ancient road, just faint traces in the sand, or stumble upon ruins near a perennial spring that marked an old waypoint. In places like Petra or Maida in Salih, ancient Hegra, the incredibly preserved architecture carved into the rock, stands as a stunning, almost defiant monument to the wealth and power generated by controlling the caravan trails. These weren't natural formations. They were built by human hands, funded by exotic spices carried thousands of miles. Think about that civilizations funded by pepper. Kind of amazing, right? The legacy of these routes goes far beyond physical remains. The trade facilitated the movement of people influencing the demography of regions. Communities grew up around trading posts and oases that might not have existed otherwise. It spurred the development of navigational techniques, desert survival skills, and logistics that were cutting edge for their time. The complex network of tribal alliances and rivalries shaped the political landscape of the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. It wasn't just about getting spices from point A to point B, it was about building systems, economies, and societies around that movement. Culturally, the routes acted as pipelines for ideas and beliefs. Religious influences, artistic styles, technological innovations. They all traveled, albeit slowly and indirectly, along with the caravans. Consider the spread of alphabets. The dissemination of irrigation techniques, or even the transmission of medical knowledge spices, were key medicinal ingredients facilitated by these long-distance interactions. While less direct than major imperial routes, the subtle exchange facilitated by centuries of merchants, drivers, and guards moving between diverse cultures added layers to the complex tapestry of the ancient world. The narrative of the Incense Route and the Arabian spice trade also fed into the Western imagination, contributing to a sense of the exotic, mysterious Orient. A land of incredible wealth, strange customs, and luxurious goods guarded by powerful, often untrustworthy middlemen. Remember those crazy stories about bird-guarded cinnamon? That exotic image fueled by tales from the route persisted for ages and influenced how Europeans viewed the lands to the east. It's fascinating how the lack of true information about the source only added to the allure and allowed myths to flourish. The fewer details people in Rome had about how cinnamon was actually harvested, the more fantastical the Arabian stories could become. In more modern times, these routes have become subjects of intense archaeological and historical study. Archaeologists excavate ancient ports, wells, and settlements along the suspected paths, unearthing evidence of the goods traded pottery shards. Coin hoards preserved organic remains, the people who lived and worked there, housing structures, cemeteries, tools, and the connections to distant lands, foreign artifacts, inscriptions. This painstaking work allows us to piece together a clearer picture of the routes than the sometimes confused accounts from ancient writers provide. Today, the importance of spices has shifted dramatically. While still valued in cuisine worldwide, they are commodities like any other mass-produced and shipped globally through efficient modern networks. The idea of spices being worth more than gold or requiring a multi-month camel trek across dangerous deserts guarded by warriors seems almost fantastical. We click a few buttons online and pepper arrives at our door within days. The connection to the vast distances, the human struggle, the risk, it's all gone from the modern transaction. Our pre-ground cinnamon sits on the shelf silent about the thousands of miles and hundreds of hands it would have passed through in antiquity. Yet the human impulse behind the trade remains relevant. The desire for goods from faraway places, the willingness to take risks for profit, the ingenuity in building complex logistical systems in challenging environments. These are timeless aspects of human endeavor. The Arabian spice caravans represent an early epic example of globalization, driven by demand and facilitated by mastering the challenges of a specific landscape. Mainstream historical fact: the archaeological site of Hegra Mada in Salih in Saudi Arabia, a major southern city of the Nabatean Kingdom and key stop on the Incense Route, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its well-preserved rock-cut tombs and structures that showcase the wealth and cultural influences, including Nabatean, Roman, and Egyptian elements derived from its role in the spice trade. A quirky tidbit: some Bedouin groups in modern Arabia still use knowledge and routes passed down through generation skills directly related to the navigation and resourcefulness required by the ancient caravan guides. While not hauling tons of pepper, their ability to traverse the desert and find resources connects directly back to that ancient way of life. You might see a pickup truck instead of a camel string, but some of the underlying knowledge of how to survive out there is ancient. Historians still argue about the exact volume of specific spices moved annually during the route's peak. Because ancient statistics are patchy and identifying residual organic material can be tricky, meaning the precise economic impact and true scale of the trade remains subject to ongoing calculation and debate based on new discoveries and analysis of historical texts and artifacts. The desert dust you felt imaginarily clinging to you, the scent of the spices, the rhythm of the walking, the glimpse of ancient cities born from trade. It's all part of this incredible story. A story of connecting the world when the world felt much larger and more fragmented, overcoming immense natural barriers, with ingenuity and perseverance, all for the love or maybe just the high profit margins of exotic flavor and fragrance. It's a sleepy thought now, this image of a long line of camels swaying under starry skies carrying the treasures of the East to the markets of the West. They've finished their journey for the night, and so have you. The sands are silent now, the camel bells quiet, the air settling. The journey is over, but the history remains carried on the phantom scent of long-vanished spices. The vastness. Feel it surrounding you now. The quiet stretches for miles in every direction, unbroken by the rhythmic pad of camel feet or the murmur of distant voices. Your eyelids are getting heavy. The incredible effort it took, all that energy moving across the sand, it feels immense, and yet now it's still. The faint whisper of the wind over the dunes is the only sound. Breathe slowly. In, out. Let the last images soften at the edges. The heat fades into coolness. The distant city lights twinkle briefly before disappearing into the quiet dark. All that richness, all that history is just a story now settling into the vastness of the past. Rest now. The journey is complete. You're home safe and sound, far from the biting sand and the blazing sun. Sleep is a welcoming oasis after a long trek.